Hi, welcome to our final lecture this semester. We're going to be talking about economic inequality today. You may pick up some sound on the mic of my boys playing video games in the background, but this is our last lecture here, and we're going to start talking about inequality by asking a question that is really the right one to start with, almost no matter what is the topic, right? As in, why do we care about current account deficits? Why is that a good or a bad thing, right? Or why do we care about attracting inward foreign direct investment? Why is that potentially important to economic growth, right? So we'll start with, well, why do we care about inequality? And in some sense, what we're doing is we're kind of taking, like, let's imagine kind of a straw man devil's advocate position, which would be inequality doesn't matter at all. What matters, maybe from a moral point of view, is how the poorest citizens are doing within a society, right? And so, if as long as the incomes, or how is the middle class doing in a society, and you might make the argument that as long as incomes are rising for low income and middle income individuals, then we shouldn't care, certainly not in a negative sense, if the rich are getting stratospherically rich, right? That if the cause of inequality is that, well, the low income and middle income individuals in a society are growing steadily, but the richest individuals are seeing their incomes grow even faster, maybe we shouldn't view that as a bad thing at all, right? As long as, what we should maybe be just concerned about is, as long as the rising tide is indeed lifting all boats, the fact that it's lifting some boats at a truly stellar speed shouldn't concern us, right? And so maybe we only care about inequality if it's actually coming about because the incomes of folks lower down are stagnating or falling. Then we really care about it. So maybe we care about it conditionally, right? We want to really get in, why do we care about inequality before we sort of start thinking about, like, how do we go about addressing it? So let's go after this kind of step by step. Okay. So right, so one moral starting point for thinking about why we might care about economic inequality, saying, well, what we truly care about is how poor the poorest individuals in a society are. That we care about how our society is doing in providing for the least fortunate among us in economic terms, right? Okay. Well, if that is our focus, right, then maybe the primary reason we care about economic inequality is to assess whether redistribution, taxing the rich and redistributing to the poor, whether that's a viable path to actually increasing the incomes of low income individuals in the society, right? And if income inequality is high, then there's a lot of wealth at the top to tax and redistribute. Whereas if the income distribution is pretty flat, if everybody's making roughly the same, then taxing the rich and redistributing the poor is less viable, right? So maybe we just think about inequality as an assessment of the viability of redistribution. But that's probably not the primary reason people are thinking about economic inequality. Um, so maybe we're not, but it may be that we're not concerned with wealth or income inequality per se, but actually the inequality in power that might come with that, right? So we can think here in terms of, like, political power, right? If we believe in a democracy that one person, one vote, that every citizen should have equal political power, uh, perhaps large wealth inequality undermines that. Perhaps it is that the large mega donors, whether that's folks on the right or folks on the left, but that the billionaire donor class wields entirely too much power in the U.S. political system, right? Certainly, Sheldon Adelson or George Soros or any of these individuals wields a lot more political power than you or I, right? And that's related to their level of wealth, right? Okay. So it may be that we care about economic inequality in large part because we care about political equality. Uh, and it may be that we're not so much even concerned with, or maybe in addition to being concerned with inequalities in political power, we're also concerned with inequalities in economic power, right? So we know that, investments by profit-seeking firms are going to target innovation that serve markets, right? You want to invent new products or new services for which people are willing to pay, right? And so we invest in inventing things that people are willing and able to pay for. So one of the ways this often gets discussed is in terms of like the incentives for pharmaceutical firms and what is the economic return on discovering a cure for baldness, and helping rich men not go bald at age 50. Okay, there's a large willingness and ability to pay for that cure, but perhaps very little social utility in it. And then you think about inventing a better cure for malaria, right? Which could save, millions of lives. But often the lives that are threatened by malaria are lives of relatively low income individuals in the world. And so the economic returns on a cure for malaria may be lower than a cure for baldness. And so you may get more investment in trying to cure baldness than malaria. And we might think about that as sort of, morally speaking, a misallocation of investment, right? Okay. And so some innovation is going to trickle down and some isn't, right? So if you look at whether we're talking about why it may or may not make sense to invest in NASA and designing rockets and all these things, well, there's technologies that you can point to that were designed as part of trying to get a rocket to the moon that then were useful in domestic aerospace and passenger aircraft and all these different sorts of things. And similarly, if you think about investments in a luxury Tesla automobile, right? There's a lot of R&D that goes into a Tesla, and those are pretty high-end luxury goods. But maybe a lot of those technologies, whether it's self-driving software or whether it's about the battery technology, maybe those technologies are going to trickle down into more kind of mainstream economy vehicles and may have a positive effect on global warming, right? We might think, so it's not that all innovation in the luxury goods market is socially useless, right? But we might think about uh, the fact that there are certain types of investments that if individuals kind of, as we say economically, at the bottom of the pyramid, if you think there's a few very rich people up at the top of the pyramid and a lot of relatively low income people down at the bottom, if the people down at the bottom of the pyramid don't have much economic power, then there's not a lot of innovation and investment in innovation going toward their needs, right? Um, and there may be needs that they have that really should, in kind of socially optimal terms, sort of should be invested in more. And so one of the benefits of greater economic equality is that there's more equality in purchasing power across different economic classes, meaning that business innovation is going to target the needs of lower economic classes much more the more wealth that those individuals have. Okay. And then perhaps we think that large gaps between the poor and the wealthy are inherently unethical, right? Apologize for the typo in the slide there, but we might think that there's something just inherently wrong about some people having millions of times more wealth and thousands of times more annual income than other individuals. Okay. And then we might also think that relative wealth is important to happiness, right? That we might think that what matters for an individual's well-being is not just their wealth in absolute terms, not just the total amount of goods and services they can afford to consume, but how their wealth compares to the wealth of other individuals in society. That, that in the same sense that people might care not just about absolute power, but relative power or something like this, right? And we might think that actually more equal societies are healthier, happier societies, sort of healthier in a sociological sense. So we might sort of attach a human well-being value to living in a society where everyone's relatively equal in their wealth and power. So those are all sort of different reasons we might care about inequality, and depending on the mix of reasons that we care about inequality, that's going to guide the type of solutions to inequality that are most desirable, right? So I think one of these things, sort of a good starting point when you start to develop your own personal politics about policy preferences related to inequality, because it's definitely, I mean, this is a political issue you will be voting on in a couple of weeks here and throughout your lifetime. And so thinking about why we care about inequality is really important to then sort of drilling down to what types of solutions we think are worthwhile. Okay. So in addition to why we might care about it, simply measuring economic inequality is non-trivial. There are a lot of different reasonable ways to measure it. And one thing that we'll talk about a little bit with respect to this recent book from, not that recent anymore, maybe 4 years old now, book by Thomas Piketty called Capital in the 21st Century. That was a book that really encouraged us to think about wealth inequality as opposed to simply income inequality. We tend to talk about income inequality a lot, in part because it tends to be what we have data on, that we have much better data on the distribution of incomes in society because we have an income tax. And so governments are always trying to measure the income of their citizens to collect that tax. Whereas we don't have a wealth tax, and thus governments aren't trying to measure individuals' wealth. And also, wealth is inherently quite tricky to measure, particularly if some of your wealth is held in things like real estate or yachts or art, things that are quite hard to value, where the value fluctuates over time, depreciation is tricky, all these sorts of things. So we often have poor data on wealth inequality, and so we talk about it less because we have better data on income inequality. And then even if we decide whether we're focusing on wealth or whether we're focusing on income, you can think about trying to use a Gini coefficient, if you've heard of these, which is a single number that summarizes the whole distribution of income, sort of like what's the income share of the bottom decile, of the next, of sort of the bottom 10%, the 10 to 20th percent, the 20 to 30th percentile, trying to summarize that whole curve in one number. That's the Gini coefficient. But you could talk in a slightly more precise way. Well, I don't know, it's not a more precise way, but a slightly simpler way. You could just talk about what share of income in a country or what share of wealth is held by the top 10% or the top 1%, the top tenth of a percent, right? How about how much of the wealth or how much of the income is held by the bottom 50%? So those can be sort of numbers that are helpful in quantifying certain parts of this income distribution. So essentially you have a whole curve here, and we could draw a picture of the curve, right? Usually when we're talking about data and quantitative information, a picture is actually the best way to talk about these things. But we try to summarize it numerically, and there are a variety of different ways to do it. Okay. Because I want to kind of link, this is the last lecture in the course, I'm trying to kind of tie some various threads together. I threw in one slide worth of information here about kind of the Black Death and income inequality. And so if we look back to the Black Death, the bubonic plague, right, that hit Western Europe a number of centuries ago, 30% of the population of Europe gets wiped out, right? So huge percentage, right? What's the factor of production that becomes relatively more scarce, and what factor of production becomes relatively more abundant, right? And so what you get is the labor supply just crashes, right? But the supply of land stays static, right? And the supply of capital actually stays static as well, right? And so, but you just have this huge fall off in labor, which increases wages, right? So the Black Death actually raises wages and decreases economic inequality because it raises wages, and it actually, in addition to raising wages, it also raises the political power of laborers, right? And so you get actually some political changes kicked off by the Black Death as well. So it's, the relative scarcity of factors of production affects both economic power and political power. Okay. All right. So if we're going to talk about inequality, a good starting point is sort of some descriptive statistics. So, this is tracking income of folks in the 95th percentile for the US, and this is 2007 constant dollars, so inflation adjusted incomes, going back to essentially the end of World War II, right? And what you see is that, and again, we talked about this briefly, but how you adjust, we say, oh, and constant $2007, like this is somehow some easy rote calculation to figure out how to appropriately adjust for inflation from 1945 all the way through to, in this case, like this data stops in like 2008. But again, the basket of goods that people are buying in 2008 is wildly different from what you were buying in 1955. Okay, yes, you might buy a car in 1955 and you might buy a car in 2008, but those are very, very different vehicles, right? And, how do you think about a smartphone? How do you think about even a telephone or even a computer or a television, right? Yes, okay, you had televisions in 1950, but very, very different than the television you're buying in 2005, right? So trying to figure out how to measure inflation when the basket of goods changes very dramatically over time. I just want to say, like, there's a non-trivial amount of measurement error or just measurement imprecision in how we do this. There are multiple different reasonable ways to think about how much incomes have or have not increased in real terms over the last, half a century. Okay, but regardless of how you measure it, you're going to see a relatively similar pattern where economic inequality has gone up dramatically since post World War II, where you had pretty strong income growth across groups up through kind of the 60s. And by the 70s, you really had flattening incomes for particularly lower income individuals. Their incomes just stopped going up nearly as much as wealthy individuals. And we can measure this a few different ways. Um, this is real family incomes measured slightly differently. And here we've got median 20th percentile, 95th percentile. And here you see them sort of going up very similarly. And so this is as a percentage of the 1973 level, right? So they sort of picked that as, okay, this is the point where we're going to have them all three together, and saying that they were all kind of going up the same rate until about 1973, and then they split out, right? Split out from there. That was when kind of the top 5% of the income distribution really started to pull away from everybody else. Was sort of in the early 70s. Okay, we can also think about measuring inequality as the share of total income that's captured by the top 1% of earners. And this sort of shows it peaking right before the stock market collapse in 1928 at about 24%. So 24% of all the income earned that year in the United States was earned by the top 1% of earners. Collapses down when the stock market busts, goes back up, but comes well down kind of in the, so the income share of the top 1% is at its lowest in the post World War II period, right? That 1945 to 1970 stretch was kind of uh, the most even distribution in incomes that we've had in since we've had decent data on this in the United States, and probably ever, honestly. And then it really starts to shoot up, depending on how you're measuring this, either in the early 70s and certainly by the 80s, it's rocketing up. It collapses down briefly during the global financial crisis and then starts to climb again. Um, okay, so that's kind of roughly what's been happening with inequality in the United States, and it's why we've been talking about it so much, right? We're talking about it because we've sort of the recent decades have been this kind of trajectory uh, where income where income inequality has been growing quite rapidly, and incomes of particularly lower income Americans have been stagnating. Okay, so Piketty's book was really pretty influential. It kind of it came at the right time when it was released, in that it was released at a time when economic inequality was already very much something that was central in the political debates in the United States and in Western Europe. And the book essentially brought to the table some really, really good data. And I like so I signed about a 3-minute video that summarizes the book quite nicely. So if you haven't watched that, go ahead and watch that video. But a couple of points. One is that he's encouraging us to think about wealth inequality instead of income inequality, and that really what the book does is provide incredible new data for a handful of European countries going back several centuries on wealth inequality. So just a much better historical look than we've been able to have before, with some really kind of dedicated data work in the economic history kind of realm. And for Piketty, for him, sort of the moral issue at stake is whether wealth comes from income you've earned or income you've inherited. For him, the moral issue is your level of wealth that you enjoy should reflect kind of who you are and what you've done, and not who your parents or grandparents were and what they have done. Right. So to him, kind of massive amounts of inherited wealth are a moral issue. And so there's a lot of sort of focus there. And he proposes a range of kind of potential solutions particularly focusing on a global wealth tax, but talking also about land taxes, estate taxes, which are various forms of inheritance tax. Um, so thinking about like how do you deal, if you have a lopsided distribution of wealth, how do you improve that over time rather than seeing those disparities increase over time, right? And Piketty is sort of suggesting that without a major policy intervention, wealth inequality is going to continue to expand over time. And Piketty's argument for why that's the case is that he believes that the return on capital is going to be higher than the economic growth rate kind of indefinitely. That may or may not be the case, right? I think like that's the place where this book has gotten the most successful pushback from other economists and other thinkers. That it's not entirely clear that we should expect the return on capital to be higher than the rate of economic growth going forward. And indeed, what might be a little bit more important in determining whether uh, wealth inequality continues to increase or whether it starts to decrease again. Um, Probably what's more important over time is the relative savings rates of the rich and the poor. So not just the returns on capital, but the rate at which new income is saved. Okay. One of the things to sort of point out in the data is actually that because Piketty has this large focus on inherited wealth, but recent growth in inequality, at least in the United States, is mostly driven by what we might call the working rich. So it's not actually primarily driven by heirs and heiresses whose fortunes are exploding because their investments have been very profitable. It's actually a lot about the growth of incomes of people who own kind of mid-sized businesses, right? The kind of businesses that have between 50 and 500 employees, right? Which are large businesses and can, make a massive amount of money for their owner operators. Um, but those are people who are working very hard and earning those incomes themselves. And so at least in the United States context, inherited wealth is probably not the whole picture here in terms of why wealth inequality is going up so much in the United States. Okay. So the next, and really I think the last thing I'm going to talk about in the recorded part of this lecture today is just a little bit of ways to start thinking about the minimum wage, right? Because this is going to be one of those policy issues that you all are asked to vote on kind of over the next few years, next few decades, right? This is one of the proposals, so we can talk some in class if you want about a universal basic income. We can talk about wealth taxes. We can talk about sort of some of the other policy proposals that are on the table to address income inequality, free college, some of these sorts of things. But at least today, the one I decided to pick out of that menu list of options is the minimum wage. And we've recently, kind of over the last 5 years, moved toward a $15 minimum wage in Los Angeles, and we're now there, right? So LA County now has a $15 minimum wage, right? And what we're when we sort of think about the economic trade-offs here, we're worried about the direct job losses caused by a minimum wage, right? So there may be firms that could that could operate profitably with a $10 wage, paying a $10 wage, and were operating profitably. And then when they had to pay $15 an hour, they either had to lay off some of their employees or they had to close the business entirely, right? So there are some jobs, sort of some workers who can produce enough value for the firms they work for that the firm will employ them if the wage is $10 an hour or $12 an hour, but the firm will no longer employ them if there's a $15 an hour minimum wage. So there's going to be, so no economist is going to tell you there's no direct job losses. There's going to be some, right? The question is, how completely are those offset by the multiplier effect from wage increases, right? So one of the things that's happening when you raise workers' wages is that costs have gone up for businesses in the area. But the other thing that's happening is that incomes have gone up for a whole set of workers in the area. And a lot of those increased incomes are being plowed right back into the local economy, right? So demand for a lot of goods and services is going to be going up, right? And so there are costs for businesses, but then also opportunities. And so in the same sense that there are some jobs that were lost, There are some businesses that are able to expand and hire more people because there's more demand for the goods and services that they're producing, because there are all these workers who now have incomes that are 50% higher than they were 5 years prior. The income increase was pretty dramatic, going from sort of $10 to $15 an hour, right? Okay. So there's a lot of debate, a lot of the political debate about whether or not one should increase the minimum wage is a debate about what's the trade-off between job losses and increased incomes, right? And how large of job losses should we expect, or should we not expect any job losses on that, right? And the reality, and what we try to do is we try to measure what the effects were on employment in each different instance, and we do a bunch of econometrics and regressions. But one of the realities is that the trade-off here is going to be different in every single city and every single state, because the structures of these labor markets are different, right? It's all about the slope of the labor demand curve, which is different in every county and in every year, right? In every city, it's different at every place and at every time. So just because a minimum wage did or didn't cause an increase in unemployment in one context doesn't necessarily tell us whether it will increase unemployment when deployed in another context. And so there are going to be a lot of, you will read a lot of different economics papers estimating always slightly different effects of the minimum wage on employment. And the difference in estimates is going to come from different econometric techniques and assumptions that are made. But it's also going to come from the fact that these studies are done at different times and in different places where the labor markets have a different structure. And so no matter how perfect the studies you have from other places, it's always going to be a little bit of a gamble what the effect is going to be when the policy is rolled out in a new spot. Okay. But when I say there are these direct kind of mechanical job losses, what does that mean? So this is kind of the Econ 101 graph that particularly opponents of a minimum wage hike will point to, which is simply, if you raise the price of a wage, right? If you impose this minimum wage and you raise it up, um, sorry, this is a dead weight loss plot. My apologies. I thought I had a minimum one that was specific to the minimum wage here. So I'm going to talk about this without the graph. When you raise the price of the labor, right, you've got a labor demand curve, right, which is that the lower the price of labor is, the more people I'm going to hire. Demand curve slope downwards, right? And if you move the price of labor up, you're going to be moving left along that demand curve, and the number of workers demanded is going to be lower, right? And so if you hold everything else constant, raising the minimum wage is going to lead to job losses, right? So with a pretty simple kind of supply and demand figure, we can show that, and it's these offsetting effects, which are more general equilibrium effects, where the wage increases. Then what that's doing is that's moving the demand curve for the goods and services a firm is producing, which then shifts their demand curve outward, right? So leaving the demand for labor in place, you will lose jobs. But when you've increased individuals' wages, right, the demand for goods and services is moving out. And so the demand for labor is going to move out in the market as well. So you've moved back along the curve. At the same time, the curve is moving out. What's the net effect on employment? It's going to vary. Okay. All right. I told you minimum wage is the last thing. I lied. I forgot I had a quick bit here about global inequality as opposed to within country inequality. Because all we've talked about so far is inequality within countries. Sort of the difference between sort of the top 1% in the United States and the bottom 50% or the bottom 10%, right? But that's the income distribution within the United States. And something that we've said many times in this class is that the number one reason that people are poor in the world is that they're born in poor countries, right? That the inequality in wealth between poor countries and rich countries is much larger than the inequality between countries, right? And so if you were to look at the inequality in the globe, right, this is what the Gini coefficient looks like. And so that's sort of just treating everybody in the world as if they're part of one population, which they are, and estimating that inequality within that population. That's the globe. The United States is way down here, right? Brazil is one of the most unequal within country, so it has some of the largest within country inequality in the world, right? And here's Sweden, one of the more equal countries in the world down here, right? So that's sort of, uh, so but pointing out that inequality across countries is higher than even the inequality within the most unequal countries in the world, right? And here's what's been happening to global inequality since 1970. That at the same time, so remember, like, you know, early 70s was when economic inequality really started to kick off within country in the United States. But at the same time, global inequality has been falling, and especially since 2000. And these are, different measures of economic inequality. There's a lot of different ways to measure this. But any of them are going to show a pretty steady decline since 1970 and a pretty marked decline since 2000, right? And so this has to do with economic growth in developing countries generally being higher than economic growth in wealthy countries during this period, right? And so some of the same factors that are driving wage stagnation in lower and lower middle income workers in the United States and Western Europe are the same factors, the same sort of free trade factors that are driving economic growth in much of the developing world. And so there's some offsetting effects here that we have to wrestle with when we think about what economic policy is optimal. Um, this is a change in world income distribution over time, where in 1820, pretty much everybody's poor, and then there's a few rich people, right? And then you kind of get, in 1970, you kind of get two humps where you have, here's the countries that have already industrialized that are out here, and here's the countries that have not yet industrialized. And by 2000, you're starting to kind of get a single distribution as industrialization really has spread much more broadly. And you have a world that is both richer and more equal. And 2020, well, at least 2019 is going to look even more like this, right? And so with COVID, that's going to drive us back in terms of a lot of people have fallen back into extreme poverty in the last 6 months. Um, a lot of the economic hardships are going to be borne the brunt of the COVID financial crisis, probably unlike the global financial crisis, which hit rich countries harder. COVID is probably going to hit poor countries harder than rich countries on average, right? So we're going to lose some ground, not just in terms of absolute numbers of poor people in the world, and that's going to be a pretty catastrophic hit, but there's also going to sort of be this hit to global equality it's probably going to get worse. By the time we see the data in a year or two, we'll probably see that this has been a bad year. Um, it's been a bad year all around the world, but that it's been a bad year in developing countries in particular. Um, I do want to talk about this. Some people refer to this as the elephant plot, right? And this is real income growth at various percentiles of the global income distribution, kind of in the this is for 1988 to 2008, but you can kind of do more or less any point over the last 30 years, and you're going to see about the same thing, which is to say that a lot of the growth has been going on in the world for people. A lot of the income growth has been concentrated either among people who are roughly as rich as somebody who's in the Chinese middle class. So these are people who are working decent, newly decent jobs in developing countries and middle income countries. These are sort of the one group of winners from globalization. These are folks, owners of labor and some human capital, who are located in countries that didn't used to have access to global markets, that now have access to global markets and have seen their incomes go up dramatically as a result. And then you also have dramatic growth in the incomes of sort of the really big time capital holders. And so so the poorest of the poor are still at subsistence and haven't seen a lot of growth. And folks who are kind of lower middle class in the richest countries in the world, who are still wealthier than individuals in sort of the Chinese middle class, right? So you are in absolute terms wealthier if you're lower middle class in the United States than if you're middle class in China, but your income has been stagnating, whereas the person in the Chinese middle class has seen their incomes rocketing up. So this is sort of how growth is distributed across the distribution. All right. So that's a lot of empirics, a lot of kind of ways to think about inequality. We'll have, I hope, a very rich discussion about this in class. And thank you all for bearing with me through a slightly meandering lecture here today. And I'll see you all in person soon.